The storm didn't come with thunder. It came with silence. In a mountain town buried under snow and forgotten by the world, one man stood between survival and collapse. He was a quiet veteran who trusted systems more than people, and a retired K-9 who had already survived too much. When power failed, food vanished, and fear turned neighbors against each other, they didn't run. They built something no storm could break. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Coldwater Pass, Montana sat wedged between two ridgelines like a town that had been pressed into the mountains and forgotten. The place looked sturdy from a distance, low roofs, thick timber frames, smoke pipes punched through tin and shingle. But winter didn't care what things looked like. In mid-November, the sky had already learned a hard iron color, and the wind came down from the high country with a narrow, sharp patience, worrying at loose signs, lifting powder off the roads, pushing cold into every seam. The main street ran straight and simple, a ribbon of packed gravel and half-frozen slush bordered by a hardware store, a diner that still kept its neon on, a two-pump gas station, and the squat brick building that served as the town office and, depending on the week, the post office and emergency clinic. When the wind rose, it carried the smell of pine pitch and diesel and something faintly metallic, snow on old machinery, or maybe the memory of the mines up the valley that had long since gone quiet. People in Coldwater Pass did what mountain people always did when the seasons turned cruel. They tightened routines and lowered expectations. They stacked firewood, wrapped pipes, checked generators that hadn't been started since last year. They talked about winter the way some folks talked about debt. Inevitable, unpleasant, survivable if you didn't act stupid. They also talked about the man on the North Slope, because every town needed a story it could point to when the nights felt too long. Silas Rowan lived above the town in a decommissioned Forest Service outpost that had once been used for wildfire watch, and later, for storing equipment when the federal budget got thin. The building sat where the mountain began to lean steeply, half hidden by lodgepole pines bent by weather. From town, you could just make out its roofline when the air was clear, a low, squared shape with a radio mast that no longer carried a signal. People called it the station, though no one worked there now. They also called it Rowan's Hole, which was unfair. The place wasn't a hole. It was solid, practical, and quiet in a way that made other people uneasy, because quiet in a harsh place was either competence or trouble. Silas wasn't old, but he moved like someone who had already lived too much, early 40s maybe, lean without being fragile, shoulders set forward slightly as if he was bracing against impact that might come from any direction. His hair had gone a tired brown-gray at the temples, and he kept it clipped short, not for style, but because long hair got in the way and winter wind punished anything it could grab. He wore the same kind of clothes most men in Coldwater Pass wore, canvas work jacket, heavy boots, gloves that had been repaired more times than replaced, but his were cleaner, more deliberate. Everything on him had a reason. Even his beard was kept trimmed close, not because he cared about looking neat, but because ice caught in long whiskers and made your face hurt. His eyes were pale, the color of creek stones under thin water, and they didn't wander. They assessed. When he looked at you, it was never casual. It was as if he was quietly counting exits, weight, distance, and risk. Folks called that shell-shocked or off, depending on who was talking. The truth was simpler and harder to explain. Silas had learned habits in places where habits were the thin line between breathing and not. Beside him, always, was Echo. Echo was a Belgian Malinois, 9 years old and built like the idea of stamina, long-legged, narrow-waisted, with a chest that rose and fell slow even after exertion. His coat was fawn with a darker mask, and the fur along his spine had grayed in places, the way a hard-used tool shows wear on its edges. One ear carried a small notch, and there was a faint scar that ran under his left eye, white against the darker fur. His gaze was steady and intelligent, not the eager brightness of a young dog, but the calm, practiced focus of an animal that had been trained to work and had never quite learned how to be idle. He walked close to Silas without crowding him, matching pace as if tethered by something invisible. When Echo stopped, Silas stopped. When Echo's head turned, Silas's attention turned with it. People noticed that part more than anything. The quiet coordination, the way the man and the dog moved like a single thought split into two bodies. On Mondays, usually just after dawn, Silas came down to town. He didn't come for conversation. He came for what he needed. And then he left before the sun climbed high enough to soften the snow on the shoulders of the road. That morning the cold had teeth. The temperature wasn't even at its worst yet, but it had the particular bite that meant the weather was reorganizing itself into something meaner. Frost had filmed the windows on the diner, and the flag outside the town office snapped stiffly, the fabric sounding like cracking paper. Silas parked a dull, older model pickup at the edge of the lot near Holloway's General. The truck was clean in the way of someone who respected maintenance. No trash, no dents that hadn't earned their place. Echo jumped down first, landing soundlessly, then waited at Silas's knee while Silas locked the door and shouldered a canvas pack. The two of them crossed the lot without hurry, but without waste. Inside the store, the bell over the door gave a tired jingle. Mr. Holloway looked up from behind the counter. Calvin Holloway was in his late 50s, with a face that had been weathered into permanent squint lines and a mustache that seemed to carry half the dust of the valley. He was broad through the middle in the way men got when they spent decades standing in one place, but his hands were quick and capable, always busy with receipts, boxes, or a coffee mug. He had the careful, practiced friendliness of someone who had learned that in a small town, your tone mattered as much as your words. "Mornin', Rowan," Holloway said, as if Silas came in every day instead of once a week. He nodded down at Echo. "Mornin' to you, too." Echo didn't wag his tail. He simply watched, ears forward, calm. Silas gave a brief nod that served as greeting and agreement both. He moved through the aisles with a quiet precision, taking flour, dried beans, salt, coffee, fuel canisters, gauze, and a small bottle of iodine. The choices told a story if you knew how to read them. Not indulgence, not panic buying, but a measured strategy. Holloway watched without staring. He was curious the way people were curious about storms, fascinated, respectful, and slightly afraid. At the counter, Holloway rang up the items. "Looks like you're setting in for it," he said, keeping his voice light. Silas met his eyes for half a second. "It's coming," he replied. Not dramatic, not ominous, just factual. As if he'd checked a gauge and didn't feel like arguing with the needle. Holloway's smile tightened, then eased back into place. "They say we might get an early push from the north. Radio's been yapping about it." Silas slid cash across the counter. "They're late," he said, and that was all. Outside, as Silas loaded supplies into the truck, a woman watched from the diner window across the street. Her name was Mara Klein, and in Coldwater Pass, she functioned as half the town's nervous system. Mara was in her mid-30s, tall and wiry, with copper-red hair usually twisted into a messy knot that never stayed put. Her skin was pale with a scatter of freckles across her nose, and her eyes were a sharp green that missed very little. She waited tables at the diner and, when needed, organized meal trains, charity drives, and the kind of quiet help that kept people from falling through the cracks. She had an open face that would have looked warm if not for the constant edge of concern that winter carved into everyone. Mara didn't dislike Silas. She didn't know him well enough to dislike him, but she didn't trust silence either. Silence in a small town felt like withheld information, and Mara hated not knowing what people carried. She stepped out as Silas shut the tailgate. The wind hit her immediately, tugging her apron against her legs. "Rowan," she called, keeping her voice casual, like she was just saying hi to a neighbor. Silas paused. Echo turned his head toward her, still calm. Silas's posture didn't change, but his attention did. It narrowed. "You're heading back up?" Mara asked. She had the kind of smile that tried not to look like a question. "Yes," Silas said. Mara adjusted her scarf, then nodded toward the sky where the clouds were thickening into a flat, dull sheet. "They're saying it'll drop hard this week. People are, well, they're doing the usual pretending." Silas's gaze followed hers for a moment, then returned to her face. "Pretending doesn't heat a house," he said. Mara exhaled, almost a laugh, but it carried no humor. "No, it doesn't." She glanced at Echo, then back to Silas. "Does he ever get tired?" Echo's ears flicked once at the sound of her voice. Silas's mouth moved in the smallest hint of something. Not quite a smile, not quite softness. Just recognition. He rests when it's safe, Silas said. Same as me. Mara hesitated. If things get bad, she started, then stopped, as if she didn't want to invite the words into the air. Silas didn't rescue her sentence. He simply looked past her toward town, toward the clustered roofs and the thin lines of smoke. For a moment, his face went still in a way that made Mara's stomach tighten, because it looked like someone listening to a distant sound nobody else could hear. Echo's body remained relaxed, but his eyes sharpened, attentive. Silas opened the driver door. When it gets bad, he corrected, and his voice stayed level. Don't wait for the second storm. Mara swallowed. What does that mean? Silas climbed in and started the engine. The truck rumbled alive, a low growl that the wind immediately tried to steal. He leaned across the cab, window down just enough that his words didn't have to fight the glass. It means, he said, people lose more food to hesitation than to cold. Then he rolled up the window and pulled away, Echo watching through the rear glass until Mara became smaller than just another shape in the white. Silas took the north road out of town, tires crunching over frozen gravel. The climb began almost immediately, winding through pines that grew denser as the elevation rose. Snow lay in wind-carved waves along the shoulders, and the air up here felt cleaner but also less forgiving, like it had been stripped of anything soft. Echo stood with his front paws braced on the passenger seat, head angled forward, eyes scanning the trees and the turns. When the outpost finally came into view, it looked exactly like it had to. Low, unremarkable, built to endure rather than impress. Silas parked, unloaded his supplies, and carried them inside. The interior smelled faintly of wood smoke and clean canvas. A small stove in the corner held a steady, conservative flame. Shelving lined one wall, not cluttered, but arranged with the careful order of someone who trusted systems more than luck. Containers were labeled in neat block letters: batteries, fuel, medical, dry goods, everything in its place. Silas set the bags down and stood still for a moment, listening. Outside, the wind was rising again, dragging its nails along the building's siding. The sky had dimmed, though it was still early. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the high country was pulling a lid over itself. Echo moved to the door and sat facing outward, posture loose but ready. Silas looked at the shelves, then at the small weather radio on the counter. The radio crackled with a warning tone, then a voice that sounded too casual for what it was describing. Arctic front, rapid drop, heavy snow, potential outages. Silas didn't react with fear. Fear was loud and unhelpful. He reacted with work. He unpacked, rotated stock, checked seals, measured fuel, and wrote a short list on a notepad. Echo followed him from room to room, a quiet shadow with a heartbeat. By late afternoon, the light had flattened to the color of ash. Coldwater Pass was down the mountain, tucked into its familiar habits. Silas could imagine them. Doors being latched, stoves being fed, people telling themselves they'd seen worse. He had seen worse too, but that didn't make this harmless. He stepped outside for one last look at the sky. The wind hit him hard, immediate, like a shove. The clouds had tightened into a single heavy ceiling, and snow began to drift sideways in thin testing lines, winter sampling the ground, deciding where to strike first. Echo stood beside him, shoulder brushing Silas's leg, eyes bright with focus. Silas breathed in the cold until it burned, then let it out slow. All right, he murmured, not to the weather, not to fate, just to the reality of what was coming. He rested his gloved hand on Echo's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath the fur. We start now. He went back inside and shut the door. The latch clicked with a finality that sounded, in the growing wind, like the first small decision that might later matter more than anyone could understand. By morning, the storm had learned how to settle in. Snow didn't fall so much as it accumulated, quiet and deliberate, layering the world until sound itself felt padded. The outpost windows had frosted from the edges inward, delicate patterns creeping across the glass like living things. Silas woke before the light. The habit burned into him long before Montana, long before the station. The stove was still warm, just where he had left it, and the radio muttered low, static-heavy warnings that said the same thing in different words. Colder, heavier, longer. Echo was already awake. The dog lay near the door, head up, ears angled not forward but outward, listening to the mountain rather than the room. His breathing was slow and even, but the tension in his shoulders told Silas enough. Something had changed overnight. Not danger yet, just pressure, the kind that preceded failure. Silas pulled on his boots and jacket, moving quietly out of habit rather than necessity. He checked the door seal, ran his hand along the frame, felt the vibration of the wind working the building like a test. He opened the door only long enough to step outside, the cold snapping at his face immediately, sharp enough to sting the inside of his nose. Snow had drifted halfway up the lower wall, packed tight by gusts that cut across the slope. He scanned the tree line, the access road, the ridge above. No movement, no tracks, just white and gray, and the sound of wind dragging ice across ice. Echo stepped out beside him, paws sinking slightly, nose lifting as he sampled the air. At 9 years old, Echo didn't waste energy on excitement. He catalogued. His tail stayed low, still. After a moment, he huffed once, a soft sound that meant unfamiliar human scent, old but nearby. Silas noted it and filed it away. Inside, Silas ran his checks again. Fuel was fine, food was stable, water tanks were insulated and unfrozen. He made a pot of coffee strong enough to taste like purpose and drank it standing, eyes on the window as the sky slowly lightened to a dull, indistinct gray. The mountain held, but storms didn't announce how long they planned to stay. Mid-morning, the radio crackled with something different, a break in the tone, a pause too long between words. Then, a voice Silas recognized, not by name, but by cadence. Anyone receiving this, be advised. Power's out along Main and West Spur. Repeat, power's out. Generator failure at the store. The transmission cut off. Silas didn't curse. He set the mug down and looked at Echo. "That's early," he said. Echo's ears tipped forward. Silas packed a small kit, headlamp, med supplies, rope, extra gloves. He hesitated for only a second before adding 2 fuel canisters and a bundle of insulated blankets. He didn't plan to stay long. He just planned to see. The road down was already disappearing, snow filling the tire tracks left from yesterday like they had never existed. Silas drove slow, steady, letting the truck do what it was built to do. Halfway down, he saw the reason Echo had flagged the scent earlier. A pickup sat nose first in a drift off the shoulder, hazard lights dead, driver's door open just enough to let snow sneak in. Silas stopped well back and cut the engine. Echo was out before he could say anything, circling once, then freezing, eyes locked on the cab. "Easy," Silas murmured, hand on Echo's collar. A man stumbled out from behind the truck, waving one arm. He was big in a way that suggested strength that had gone unused too long, shoulders broad but sagging, belly pulling against a flannel jacket that had seen better winters. His beard was thick and untrimmed, already collecting ice, and his cheeks were red with cold and effort. He moved like someone used to being in charge of his space and angry at finding himself small. "Hey!" the man shouted, voice raw. "You got a tow?" Silas assessed him quickly, early 40s, hands bare, knuckles cracked, pride louder than planning. "No," Silas said. "I've got rope." The man squinted, then laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Figures. Name's Dean Mercer. I run freight between here and Silver Junction, or I did." Dean's eyes flicked to Echo, then back to Silas. There was a moment of calculation there, how much help this stranger was, how much risk. "Road just disappeared on me," Dean went on, talking fast now, heat bleeding out of him. "Lost traction. Radio's dead. I was heading back for supplies." Silas nodded once. "You're not driving out of that." Dean opened his mouth to argue, then closed it as a gust hit, nearly knocking him sideways. Silas tossed him a pair of spare gloves. "Put those on." They worked in silence, Echo moving when needed, staying clear when not. Silas anchored the rope to a stand of pines uphill and guided Dean through the mechanics of digging out, step by step. Dean listened, grudging at first, then with growing relief as the instructions made sense and the work became purposeful instead of frantic. When the truck finally shifted, it wasn't freed. It was stabilized enough to not become a coffin. "You can walk with us," Silas said, "or you can sit in there and hope the wind doesn't seal you in." Dean didn't argue this time. They reached town just as the snow began to thicken again. Coldwater Pass looked smaller without power, its usual landmarks dim to shadows. The general store's front windows were dark, and a knot of people stood outside, bundled and anxious. Calvin Holloway was among them, his mustache rimed with frost, face drawn tight. "There you are," Holloway said when he spotted Silas. Relief cracked through his voice before he smoothed it over. "Generator seized up. We got lights for maybe an hour on battery, then nothing." Silas took in the crowd. Mara Klein stood near the diner door, apron swapped for a heavy coat, red hair escaping its knot in wind-torn strands. Her eyes found Silas immediately, sharp with questions she hadn't asked yet. Beside her was an older man Silas didn't recognize, tall and spare, wearing a sheriff's coat with the badge dulled by years of wear. "That's Sheriff Tom Caldwell," Holloway said, following Silas's gaze. "Came in from the west last spring." Caldwell stepped forward. He was in his late 50s, with a long face cut by deep lines and a jaw that looked like it had learned to set itself and stay there. His beard was salt and pepper and neatly trimmed, his eyes steady but tired. There was a careful distance in his stance, the posture of someone who had learned not to crowd strangers or situations. "Rowan," he said, offering a hand. Silas shook it, firm, brief. "We're consolidating," Caldwell said. "People without heat are bunking at the school and the church, but food's already an issue." Silas glanced at the sky, then back at Caldwell. "It'll get worse before it gets better." Caldwell nodded. "That's what I was afraid you'd say." Dean Mercer hovered near the edge of the group, rubbing his hands together, pride bruised but not broken. "I heard," he said, voice pitched low, "that you've got storage up the mountain. Stable storage." Silas didn't answer immediately. He looked at Mara. She met his gaze without flinching, worry plain on her face now, stripped of casual humor. "We lost half the diner's freezer last night," she said, "and people are going to start opening doors they can't close." Silas felt the weight of it settle, not fear, but responsibility. He had built systems for small numbers, for control. Towns were messy. Towns panicked. Towns broke rules when rules felt optional. Echo sat at his heel, calm, present. "Not today," Silas said finally. "Today you stabilize what you can here. Tonight you don't let anyone burn through their last fuel trying to pretend tomorrow will be warm." "And tomorrow?" Caldwell asked. Silas met his eyes. "Tomorrow you come up the mountain, one person, we talk." The wind surged again, rattling signs and sending a scatter of ice across the street. Somewhere down the line, a child cried, thin and sharp. Silas turned back toward his truck. Echo rose with him. He paused once, just long enough to look at the people gathered there, faces drawn tight with the first real understanding that winter wasn't a visitor this year, but a test. "Don't wait for the second storm," he said again, louder this time, not as a warning, but as instruction. Then he drove back up the slope, leaving Coldwater Pass to sit with the truth a little longer. The storm did not loosen its grip overnight. It pressed closer, heavier, as if it had found the town and decided to test it properly. By dawn, Coldwater Pass lay under a uniform sheet of white, edges erased, distances shortened. Sound traveled poorly in that kind of cold. Even the wind seemed to swallow its own voice. From the outpost, Silas watched the weather work its way down the slopes, methodical and patient. He had learned long ago that storms weren't angry. They were thorough. Echo stood beside him at the window, posture relaxed but intent. The dog's muzzle had frosted slightly from breathing against the glass, and he wiped it once with a quick shake of his head, ears settling back into place. Silas turned from the view and checked the radio. The signal was weak but present, the voice on the other end strained and clipped. Power was still out in most of town. The school gym was full. The church basement was colder than expected. Fuel was being rationed, without anyone saying the word out loud. By mid-morning, the access road held a single set of tracks cutting through the new snow. Silas heard the engine long before he saw the vehicle crest the bend. He didn't reach for anything. He simply waited, hands loose at his sides, Echo seated near the door. Sheriff Tom Caldwell climbed out of the truck first. He moved carefully on the packed snow, boots placed deliberately, as if every step carried weight beyond balance. In daylight, Silas could see more of him, the sharp angle of his cheekbones, the gray threaded through his beard, the faint scar at the edge of his jaw that looked old enough to have faded into memory. Caldwell wore authority the way some men wore a coat, useful, heavy, and never forgotten. He glanced around once, cataloging the outpost, the slope, the trees, then nodded to himself. Mara Klein followed him out, pulling her hood tighter against the wind. She looked smaller up here, stripped of the diner's warmth and noise, but no less alert. Her cheeks were raw with cold, freckles standing out against pale skin, red hair escaping in curls that the wind immediately claimed. She carried a notebook tucked under one arm, the kind people used when they were afraid of forgetting something important. They waited until Silas opened the door. "You said one person," Caldwell said, not accusatory, just factual. "I said we'd talk," Silas replied. He glanced at Mara. "She listens." Mara lifted her chin slightly. "And I remember." Echo stood and moved forward, stopping a few feet from them. He did not growl. He simply existed, solid and attentive. Mara noticed him first, then smiled despite herself. "He's older than I thought," she said softly. 9, Silas said. "He doesn't waste time." Inside, the outpost felt smaller with more bodies, but not cramped. The stove ticked gently as it worked. The shelves were visible from the doorway, neat and intentional. Caldwell's eyes went there immediately. He didn't comment, but something eased in his shoulders, just enough to notice. They sat at the small table. Silas poured coffee into 3 mugs without asking. It wasn't hospitality. It was efficiency. Mara cupped hers with both hands, breathing in the steam like it might carry reassurance. "We're close to losing control," Caldwell said after a moment. He spoke plainly, the way he would have spoken to deputies or men on a line. "Not panic yet, but we're burning through good options fast." Silas nodded. "You're still trying to preserve normal," Caldwell huffed quietly. "People expect it." "They shouldn't," Silas said. He leaned back, chair creaking softly. "Normal is expensive in winter." Mara flipped open her notebook. "We're not here to ask you to save the town," she said, meeting Silas's gaze directly. "We're here to ask what you can do without breaking what you've built." That earned her a longer look. Silas considered her. Tall, sharp-eyed, tired, but still upright. Someone who held things together with lists and tone rather than force. He respected that. "I don't run a charity," Silas said. "And I don't run a free-for-all. If I open storage, it's on terms." Caldwell nodded once. "That's what we expected." Silas stood and motioned them toward the shelving. He didn't embellish as he spoke. He pointed, explained, outlined. Temperature stability, ventilation, rotation, capacity. He spoke the way engineers spoke when they trusted their work, without drama. Mara's pencil moved quickly, her handwriting tightening as the information stacked up. Caldwell asked questions that cut to risk. Collapse, fire, theft. Silas answered them all. Echo followed at a distance, stopping when Silas stopped, sitting when the conversation slowed. At one point, Caldwell glanced down at him. "He always like this?" he asked. "He's trained," Silas said, "and he's tired of surprises." "So am I," Caldwell said quietly. The terms came next. Silas laid them out without negotiation. No crowds, no secrecy. 1 access window per day, inventory logged and witnessed, priority to children, elderly, and medical needs. Anyone caught hoarding lost access entirely. Anyone causing panic didn't come back. He spoke as if these rules were as natural as gravity. Mara hesitated at one point. "People won't like all of this." "They don't have to," Silas said. "They have to live." Caldwell studied him for a long moment. "You ever think about what happens when word gets out beyond town?" Silas met his gaze evenly. "I'm thinking about what happens if it doesn't." The decision was made without ceremony. They shook hands, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement of shared risk. Caldwell pulled his coat back on, movement stiff with cold and consequence. "We'll start small," Caldwell said. "Test the system," Silas nodded. "You'll start with who needs it most." Mara lingered at the door. "You know," she said, quieter now, "people think you're doing this because you don't want to be alone up here." Silas looked past her, out at the slope where snow was already beginning to fill the road again. "People think a lot of things," he said. Then, after a beat, being alone is easy. Being responsible isn't. Down in town, the first group arrived that afternoon. Caldwell escorted them himself, a young couple with a bundled infant, and an older man named Harold Finch, whose hands shook too badly now to split wood. Finch was narrow and stooped, skin like parchment, eyes sharp behind thick glasses. He smelled faintly of smoke and fear. He clutched a canvas bag like it was a lifeline. Silas didn't rush them. He showed them where to stand, where not to touch. He recorded names and amounts. He spoke less than Caldwell, but when he did, people listened. Echo stayed near the entrance, presence calm and unquestioned. The system held. By evening, the snow began again in earnest, thick flakes turning the world into a narrowing tunnel of light and shadow. The radio carried a final update before going quiet entirely. More outages, roads closed, emergency services stretched thin. Silas locked the door after the last group left and leaned his forehead briefly against the wood. It was not exhaustion that made him pause, but the understanding of momentum. Once you started something like this, you didn't stop. You adapted, or you failed. Echo pressed close, a steady warmth at his side. "All right," Silas murmured, "we're in it now." Outside, Coldwater Pass settled into a deeper silence, one shaped by shared dependence rather than ignorance. The outpost lights glowed faintly through the snow, not a beacon, not a promise, just proof that preparation, once shared, became something heavier and harder to abandon. The third day of distribution began before dawn, not because Silas wanted it to, but because the mountain insisted. The temperature had dropped again overnight, the kind of drop that didn't announce itself with drama, only with consequences. Metal complained, wood tightened, breath came out brittle. From the outpost window, the snow looked solid enough to hold shape, like the world had been cast rather than fallen into place. Silas was already awake, writing in the ledger by lantern light. His handwriting stayed steady even when his mind ran ahead, tracking counts and margins, recalculating how long the system could absorb strain before something cracked. Echo lay near the door, chin on paws, eyes open. He had slept, but not deeply. Neither had Silas. Systems worked best when they were respected. People didn't always respect what they didn't understand. The first knock came early. Caldwell arrived alone this time, his truck idling poorly in the cold. He looked more tired than yesterday, jaw set harder, beard rimed with frost. The lines around his eyes had deepened, not from age, but from decisions that had begun stacking faster than solutions. "Before we start," Caldwell said as Silas poured coffee, "you should know something." Silas waited. "There was an argument last night," Caldwell continued, "at the school, about access, about who's getting what." Silas nodded. "There would be." "No one got hurt," Caldwell said, "but it wasn't nothing. People are counting other people's bags now." Silas closed the ledger. "Names?" Caldwell hesitated. "A few. Nothing official yet." "That means something," Silas said. They opened the door together. Echo stood and took position at Silas's left, body angled slightly toward the approach, posture neutral but unmistakably alert. The road up had been cleared just enough to pass on foot, a narrow trench through shoulder-high drifts. The first group arrived quietly, two elderly sisters who walked arm in arm, a man with frostbite bandages on his fingers, a young mother whose face carried the flat focus of someone conserving energy. Silas processed them without incident. Caldwell observed. The system held. The fourth visitor did not fit the rhythm. He came up the road alone, moving fast despite the cold, shoulders hunched forward like he was pushing through something invisible. He was tall, broad through the chest, with a long stride that suggested confidence bordering on impatience. His coat was new, too new for the season, and worn open, as if he wanted to be seen rather than protected. He had a heavy beard trimmed to a point, dark hair pulled back at the nape, and eyes that flicked over the outpost with proprietary interest. When he spoke, his voice carried the echo of rooms where people usually listened. "Morning," he said, smiling without warmth. "Heard this was where the smart folks were going." Caldwell stiffened. "Name?" "Lucas Brand," the man said easily. "I own 3 cabins on West Spur. Or I did until the road vanished." Silas studied him. Brand smelled faintly of cologne beneath the cold, a detail that didn't matter except that Silas noticed it. Brand's hands were bare, unmarked, not the hands of someone who had dug out a neighbor's truck or split wood for an elderly sister. He held himself like a man accustomed to leverage. "You're not on the list," Caldwell said. Brand waved a dismissive hand. "I don't need to be. I brought supplies." He nodded toward the road behind him, where two men now appeared, hauling a sled piled with boxes. The men were younger, faces tight with cold, eyes darting, hired help. They stopped when Echo's gaze settled on them. Silas stepped forward. "You don't buy access," he said calmly. "You follow terms." Brand's smile tightened. "Terms are flexible when circumstances change." "They're not," Silas replied. Brand laughed once, sharp. "You think you get to decide that? You're one man in a shed." Echo stood, body still, eyes fixed, not aggressive, certain. Caldwell moved between them, voice firm. "Mr. Brand, you're welcome to return with the rest tomorrow. One person, one window." Brand's eyes flicked to Caldwell, then back to Silas. Something hardened there. "I'm not waiting while my property freezes." Silas met his gaze. "Then you should have planned better." The hired men shifted. One of them swallowed hard, cheeks reddening. He looked younger up close, barely out of his 20s, with stubble that didn't quite hide the softness in his face. He glanced at Brand, then at Echo, then back at the sled, weighing loyalty against survival. Brand exhaled through his nose. "Fine," he said too quickly. "Another time." He turned sharply and stalked back down the road, the sled scraping after him, the men hurrying to keep up. The snow swallowed their tracks almost immediately. Caldwell let out a breath he'd been holding. "That's not over." "No," Silas said. "It's begun." By afternoon, the sky dimmed again, the light thinning to a gray that flattened edges and swallowed distance. The radio stayed silent. Distribution continued, slower now, more careful. People spoke less. Eyes lingered longer on the shelves, on each other. Silas noticed everything, the way hands shook when bags were lifted, the way voices tightened when numbers were read aloud. Scarcity changed posture before it changed behavior. Mara arrived late, cheeks flushed, notebook tucked under her arm as always. She waited until the last group left before speaking. "Word's spreading," she said quietly. "Not just that there's food, that there are rules." Silas nodded. "Rules are what keep it food." She hesitated. "Brand's been talking." "Of course he has. He's telling people you're hoarding, that you're deciding who matters." Silas closed the door and slid the bolt. The sound was final in the small room. "People decide that themselves," he said. "I just make it visible." Mara studied him. "You know this puts a target on you." Silas looked at Echo, then back at her. "I've had worse." That night the wind rose again, stronger than before. The outpost groaned softly, a living thing under pressure. Silas slept in bursts, waking at sounds that never fully resolved into danger. Near midnight, Echo's head lifted. He didn't bark. He moved to the door, body low, listening. Silas was on his feet instantly. There were voices outside, muffled, tense, footsteps in the snow, a scrape against the wall. Silas didn't open the door. He moved to the side window and peered out. Shapes shifted in the dark. Two figures, hunched, working at something near the storage vent. One slipped, swore under his breath. Echo growled then, low and precise, a sound that carried intent without volume. Silas flicked on the exterior light. The figures froze. The light revealed the younger hired man from earlier, eyes wide with fear, and another man older and thinner, face gaunt with desperation. They stepped back slowly, hands raised. We just needed a little," the older man said, voice breaking. Brand said, Silas opened the door, stepping out into the cold. Echo followed, positioning himself between Silas and the men. "You don't take from a system," Silas said evenly. "You ask, or you leave." The younger man's shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know what else to do." Silas studied them both, then nodded once toward the road. "Go," he said, "and tell him it won't work." They didn't argue. When the door closed again, the outpost felt smaller, tighter. Silas leaned against it for a moment, feeling the weight settle deeper. The fracture lines were there now, visible, not in the walls, but in people. Echo pressed against his leg, solid and warm. "Tomorrow," Silas murmured, more to himself than to the dog. we reinforce. Outside, the storm listened, patient as ever, waiting to see what would break next. The morning after the attempted break-in arrived without light. Snow still fell, but thinner now, like the storm was catching its breath. The cold remained absolute, a presence rather than a measurement. Silas rose before Echo this time, joints stiff, mind already moving. He had spent the night recalculating, not supplies, but people. How many hands, how many mouths, how many names he could hold before the ledger became something else entirely. Echo stirred when Silas reached for his jacket. The dog rose, shook once, and followed, nails clicking softly against the floor. At the door, Silas paused, listening. No voices, no scraping, just wind worrying the trees. He opened the door and let the cold in for a moment, letting it say its piece, then shut it again. They reinforced before anyone arrived. Silas rerouted access through a narrower entry, moved the daily allotment into a secondary room, and locked the main storage with a heavier bar. It wasn't about force. It was about friction, making bad decisions harder to act on. Echo watched, occasionally nosing a crate into place as if he understood the intent rather than the task. By mid-morning, Caldwell arrived with a different look on his face, not just tired now, set. He carried a clipboard, the paper edges curled from damp and cold. "We need to change the order," he said without preamble. "Medical first." Silas nodded. "Who?" Caldwell read from the list. 3 cases of respiratory distress, 1 diabetic low on insulin, and a leg infection that's turning ugly. Silas pulled boots on. "Where?" "The clinic's closed," Caldwell said. "Power never came back. Nurse is working out of her house." Silas didn't ask why the nurse wasn't at the school or the church. He already knew the answer. Not enough heat, not enough space, too many variables. He packed a med kit heavier than the last, adding antibiotics he had traded for months ago and never expected to use. Echo stood ready. The nurse's house sat on the south edge of town, a narrow place with a sagging porch and a chimney that smoked unevenly. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and wood smoke. The nurse met them at the door, shoulders squared against fatigue. Her name was Eleanor Pike, late 40s, hair cut short and going gray without apology. She was small but solid, the kind of woman whose strength lived in endurance rather than size. Her face held deep lines at the mouth, earned from years of speaking calmly in loud rooms. Her hands were steady, stained faintly with iodine. "You're Rowan," she said, not asking. "About time," Silas accepted the tone. "Show me." They worked for hours. Silas followed instructions without comment, handing supplies, holding limbs, keeping time. Echo lay near the stove, eyes tracking movement, ears flicking at raised voices or sharp sounds. One patient, a man with a fever and a leg swollen angry red from knee to ankle, groaned as Eleanor cleaned the wound. He was broad-shouldered, once strong, now shaking. "Didn't think it had come to this," he muttered. "It always does," Eleanor said gently, "when people wait." By the time they left, the light had shifted again, thin and slanted. Eleanor walked them to the door. "You can't do this alone," she said, meeting Silas's eyes. "Not medically. Not long-term." "I know," Silas replied. She nodded. "Then let me help. I don't need access to everything. I need predictability." Silas considered, then nodded once. "You'll get a window, an account." "That's all I want," she said. Back at the outpost, distribution resumed under tighter rules. Caldwell enforced spacing. Mara took names and times, her handwriting smaller now, more precise. People noticed the changes. Some bristled, most complied. Hunger taught manners quickly. Late afternoon brought a different kind of visitor. A man led a horse up the narrow road, the animal's breath steaming in heavy clouds. The horse was a chestnut gelding, older, ribs faintly visible under a winter coat dulled by neglect. Its hooves were wrapped in improvised padding, burlap and twine, the work clumsy but earnest. The man guiding him was lean and weathered, beard gray and long, eyes deep-set and wary. "I'm Amos Reed," he said, voice rough but controlled. "He's mine. Name's Calder." The horse shifted, ears flicking, calm despite the climb. He was big-boned, patient, with a white blaze down his nose and an old scar along the flank that spoke of wire or war. Something survived rather than healed. "We lost our hay," Amos continued. "Barn roof caved. I can't keep him fed down there." Silas studied Calder, then Amos. "Why bring him here?" "Because you plan," Amos said simply. "And he pulls. When the road opens, he'll matter." Silas considered the calculus. A horse was risk. A horse was food for rumor and desperation. A horse was also capability. He nodded toward the sheltered lean-to at the side of the outpost. "Temporary," he said. "You care for him. You log feed." Amos's shoulders loosened by a fraction. "Fair." As evening settled, Silas returned to the ledger. Names filled pages now, not tallies but stories compressed into ink. He realized, with a tightness behind the eyes, that the ledger had changed. It wasn't a record of supplies anymore. It was a map of trust. Echo rested his chin on Silas's knee. Silas scratched behind his ears absently, fingers tracing the scar beneath the left eye. "We're getting heavy," he murmured. Outside, the wind eased for the first time in days, not gone, just less insistent. In town, fires burned lower but steadier. People spoke in quieter tones, as if the system itself demanded it. Near midnight, Caldwell radioed once, brief. "Brand left town." Silas absorbed that. "Alone?" "Not sure," Caldwell said. "He took what he could carry." Silas closed the ledger. Brand leaving was not relief. It was redistribution of risk. He checked the locks one more time, then sat back, listening to the outpost settle. The weight of names pressed down, not his burden, but his obligation. He had chosen this, or rather, he had refused not to. Echo shifted closer, warmth a constant. Outside, Calder stamped once, then went still. The storm, for now, watched and waited. The night settled in deeper than the others, not louder or harsher, but heavier, as if the cold had decided to stop testing and start claiming. The wind dropped to a low, steady pressure that pressed against the outpost walls and stayed there, patient and unyielding. Snow no longer blew sideways. It fell straight down in thick, soundless curtains that erased depth and distance. Even Echo, usually alert to every change in the mountain's mood, seemed subdued by it, his movements slower, his ears less reactive. This was not a night for warnings. This was a night for endurance. Silas stayed awake long past the point where fatigue made itself known. He moved through the outpost in slow circuits, checking the stove, the locks, the shelves, the secondary room where the day's allotments had been staged. The systems were holding, but systems did not account for human breaking points. He had seen that before, in other winters, other places, other uniforms. You could plan for weather. You could plan for hunger. You could even plan for fear. What you couldn't plan for was the moment when someone decided they could not wait any longer. Echo followed him without question, nails soft against the floor, a steady presence at his flank. The dog's age showed most clearly at night. He rose more carefully now, stretched longer before settling again. But when Silas stopped, Echo stopped. When Silas listened, Echo listened harder. Near midnight, the radio crackled back to life, weak but present. Caldwell's voice came through, stripped of everything but necessity. "We've got a problem," he said. "Not at the outpost, down here." Silas didn't ask for clarification. "Where?" "School gym," Caldwell replied. "Generator's gone, pipes are freezing, people are panicking." Silas closed his eyes for a moment, already assembling the response. "How many?" 43, Caldwell said, "including kids." Silas was moving before the transmission ended. He layered up, grabbed fuel canisters, blankets, and a coil of rope. Echo was at the door, posture sharpened now, energy focused. Outside, the cold hit like a wall. The truck protested, engine turning slow, then catching with a strained growl. Calder stamped in the lean-to, sensing movement. Amos Reed appeared from the shadows, beard frosted, eyes alert. "You'll need him," Amos said, already looping the lead rope. "Truck won't make it back if the road's drifted." Silas didn't argue. He hitched the sled instead, loading supplies quickly. Echo took position ahead, nose low, testing the path. Calder leaned into the harness without complaint, breath steady, muscles bunching under his dulled winter coat. They moved out into the dark as a unit, the outpost light shrinking behind them. The town looked different at night without power. Shapes blurred together, buildings reduced to darker patches against the snow. The school gym loomed ahead, a squat rectangle with windows iced over from the inside. Voices leaked out through the walls, raised, uneven, edged with fear. Caldwell met them at the door, face tight. "Pipe burst in the locker room," he said. "Flooded, then froze. Heat's gone." Inside, the air was sharp with cold and human breath. People huddled in clusters, wrapped in coats and blankets that were no longer enough. Children cried quietly, conserving energy even in distress. Silas scanned the room, already sorting needs. He caught sight of a man standing apart from the rest, arms crossed tight against his chest, jaw clenched hard enough to ache. The man was tall and thin, with hollowed cheeks and a week's worth of unkempt beard. His hair was dark, matted with sweat at the temples despite the cold. There was something rigid in the way he held himself, like a man braced for impact long before it came. When Silas approached, the man's eyes flicked up, sharp and mistrustful. "Name?" Silas asked. "Jonah Pike," the man said. His voice was flat, controlled. "Eleanor's brother." Silas registered that instantly. "She knows you're here?" Jonah's jaw tightened. "She's busy keeping people alive." There was resentment there, but also fear. The kind that came from standing still too long. Silas nodded once. "Help me move these heaters." They worked fast. Fuel was rationed, heat concentrated into smaller zones, blankets were redistributed. Calder stood outside, steam rising from his back, while Amos and Echo kept watch at the doors. Slowly, the edge came off the room. People stopped shouting, breathing steadied. The immediate crisis bent but did not break. Then, someone screamed. It came from the far end of the gym, sharp and sudden. Silas turned in time to see a woman stumble back, hand pressed to her arm, blood bright against her sleeve. A man stood in front of her, wild-eyed, breathing hard, a broken chair leg clutched in his hand. "I needed more," the man shouted. "My kids!" Echo moved before Silas did, crossing the space in a blur of controlled speed. Placing himself between the man and everyone else, body low, eyes locked. He did not bite, he did not bark. He simply existed as an undeniable fact. The man froze, breath hitching. The chair leg dropped from his hand, clattering against the floor. Silas stepped in, voice calm, absolute. "Sit down," he said. "Now." The man collapsed onto a bench, shaking. Caldwell moved in, securing the situation without escalation. Eleanor Pike appeared from the side door moments later, face pale, eyes blazing with focus. She checked the injured woman, then turned on her brother. "What are you doing?" she demanded, voice tight with a lifetime of unspoken history. Jonah flinched. "I couldn't watch them freeze," he said. "I couldn't." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, then squared her shoulders. "You don't get to decide that alone." Silas watched the exchange, understanding more than the words conveyed. Pressure did not create monsters. It revealed fractures that had always been there. By the time they left the gym, the worst had passed. Temporary heat held. The injured woman was stable. Caldwell stayed behind to maintain order. Silas led the supplies back out into the night, Calder pulling steady, Echo pacing alongside, alert but composed. The climb back to the outpost felt longer than before. Fatigue crept in now, deep and bone level. Silas felt it in his shoulders, his knees, the slow drag behind his eyes. When the outpost finally came into view, its light felt less like safety and more like responsibility. Inside, he stripped off layers and sank onto the bench, breath heavy. Echo settled at his feet, pressing close, warmth grounding. Outside, the storm resumed its quiet watch. Silas opened the ledger and added a new page, not numbers, notes, names, Eleanor, Jonah, the woman with the bleeding arm, the children wrapped in borrowed blankets. He realized then that the system had crossed another threshold. It was no longer just about food or heat. It was about holding people together when they were most likely to tear themselves apart. He closed the ledger and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "We hold," he said softly, "not as a plan, but as a vow." Echo lifted his head, eyes meeting Silas's in the dim light. He thumped his tail once, slow and sure. Outside, the long night stretched on, but it did not win, not yet. Morning did not arrive so much as it revealed itself, light thinning the dark until shapes reappeared with careful reluctance. The storm had finally spent itself. Snow still lay deep and unbroken, but the wind had eased into something almost respectful, a low breath along the trees instead of a shove. From the outpost, Silas watched the first pale line of day slide across the slope and felt for the first time in days the quiet after-effort. Not relief, just a pause. He slept less than 3 hours before waking, joints aching, head heavy. Echo stirred at the sound, rose and padded over, pressing his shoulder into Silas's knee as if to check the connection still held. Outside, Calder stood in the lean-to, head lowered, steam lifting gently from his nostrils. Amos Reed was already there. Tightening a strap with hands made clumsy by cold and age, Amos was in his early 60s, lean to the point of brittleness, beard gone nearly white, eyes steady and unshowy. He nodded once to Silas, no words wasted. "They're moving," Amos said quietly. "Town, I mean." Silas nodded. He could feel it too, the shift from crisis to consequence. When danger receded, people began to talk. Talk could build or it could burn. Down the mountain, Coldwater Pass emerged in pieces. Doors opened. Smoke rose in thin, tentative columns. People stepped outside and counted what remained. The school gym still held those who couldn't return home yet, but the worst of the night had passed. Caldwell's radio call came mid-morning, brief and to the point. Order held, injuries stable, temp rising by a few degrees. A small mercy, but a real one. Silas gathered the morning team at the outpost. Caldwell, Mara, Eleanor Pike, and Amos. They stood in a loose half-circle near the shelves, breath fogging the air. The ledger lay open on the table, its pages thick with names and notes. Silas didn't speak immediately. He let the room settle. "We're changing how this works," he said at last. No one interrupted. "We've been reacting," Silas continued. "That kept people alive. Now we stabilize." Mara lifted her pen. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, attention sharpened. Caldwell crossed his arms, listening. "We split responsibilities," Silas said. "Medical and vulnerable lists. Eleanor, scheduling and communication. Mara, transport and outside checks. Amos with Calder, security and enforcement. Caldwell, I'll coordinate inventory and thresholds." Caldwell nodded. "About time," Mara hesitated. "People are going to ask who put you in charge." Silas met her gaze evenly. "They already know who did. Winter." They broke to work. Mara went down to town with a posted schedule and a voice that carried calm without softness. She moved through the crowd with purpose, copper hair pulled back tight, notebook tucked under her arm like a promise she intended to keep. She answered questions directly and didn't entertain rumors. People noticed. They adjusted. Eleanor set up a rotating clinic window at the outpost, limited, predictable, warm enough to function. She worked with the precision of someone who knew her limits and respected them. Her hands moved with practiced economy. Her face set into a focus that left no room for panic. Jonah Pike arrived mid-afternoon, shoulders slumped, eyes red-rimmed. He stood awkwardly at the edge, unsure of his place. Eleanor didn't coddle him. She handed him a list. "You carry," she said. "You clean. You don't decide." Jonah nodded, swallowing. The resentment had drained out of him, leaving only fatigue and shame. He did the work without complaint. Amos and Calder ran the first external check just after noon. The horse moved steady and sure, hooves finding purchase where trucks couldn't. They followed the west spur as far as it allowed, checking cabins and outbuildings. They found one family with a collapsed roof but intact pantry. Amos logged it and promised return help. They found Brand's nearest cabin empty, door ajar, snow drifted inside. Amos closed it and marked the location. No need to invite ghosts. Back at the outpost, a new face appeared near evening. Her name was Ruth Calderon, early 70s, small and upright, hair braided and tucked beneath a wool cap worn thin with years. Her skin was dark and weathered, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She walked with a cane carved smooth by use, but her posture was unbent. She had lived in Coldwater Pass longer than anyone could remember. "I hear you're keeping books," Ruth said to Silas, voice dry as pine needles. "I am," Silas replied. She peered at the ledger. "Good. Then you'll need someone who remembers what came before." Silas considered her. "What do you remember?" "Who breaks first," she said, "and who doesn't?" He handed her a chair. She sat, nodded once, and began to talk. Names, old feuds, quiet alliances, the places people hid things when they thought no one was watching. Silas listened, not for gossip, but for pattern. This, too, was logistics. As evening came on, the town gathered, not in panic but in intention. Caldwell stood on the steps of the town office, coat collar up, beard rimed with frost. He spoke plainly. He named the system. He named the roles. He named the consequences. There was grumbling, but it stayed low. Hunger taught attention. At the outpost, Silas watched the lights wink on, few, controlled, but steady. Echo sat beside him, tail thumping once when a group passed without incident. Calder stamped softly, then settled. Near nightfall, a small boy arrived with his mother, cheeks red, eyes bright with exhaustion. The boy stared at Echo with awe. Echo lowered his head slightly, ears softening. The boy smiled despite himself. Silas signed their names, handed over measured supplies, and watched them leave. He felt the weight ease, not because the work was done, it wasn't, but because the work was shared. He returned to the ledger one last time that day and drew a line across the page, not an ending, a boundary. Above it, chaos managed. Below it, structure built. Echo rose and pressed close. Outside, the mountain held its breath, no longer testing, simply watching. "We're past the worst," Silas said quietly. It wasn't hope, it was assessment, and for the first time since winter closed its fist, Coldwater Pass did not feel like it was slipping through. The thaw announced itself quietly, the way real changes often did. Not with rushing water or dramatic collapse, but with small, almost private signals. A drip from the eaves at midday, a softening in the snow where boots no longer rang sharp, the radio's static thinning until voices came through whole again. Silas noticed these things without comment. He had learned not to celebrate before the work allowed it. The morning sun climbed higher than it had in weeks, light stretching across the slope and finding corners it had forgotten. Echo lay near the door, head on paws, eyes half-lidded but alert, the fur along his spine catching the glow. Calder stood in the lean-to, shedding a winter coat in dull clumps, patient as Amos brushed him down with slow practiced strokes. The horse's ribs no longer showed. Amos did. Still, lean as ever, but there was more ease in his shoulders now, a slackening of the constant brace. Down in Coldwater Pass, the town began to test its footing. Roads were still narrow corridors carved through white, but they existed. Roofs were shoveled. Doors opened and stayed open longer. The school gym emptied in stages, families returning to homes that could hold heat again. Caldwell's voice came over the radio with news that felt almost unreal. The county plows were pushing through from the south. A supply convoy would reach the junction by nightfall if the pass held. Silas didn't move supplies yet. He waited. Thaws were treacherous. People relaxed too fast and paid for it later. He gathered the team at the outpost one last time before the day's distribution. Caldwell stood with his hands on his hips, beard trimmed now, the deep lines in his face still there but eased by sleep. Mara leaned against the table, notebook finely closed, her red hair loose for once, curls catching light. Eleanor Pike arrived with a thermos and a list shorter than it had been in days, her eyes still sharp but no longer burning. Amos came last, brushing snow from his coat, smelling faintly of hay and horse. Silas spoke without ceremony. "We draw down," he said. "Not empty. We restore." They understood. Caldwell nodded, already thinking through enforcement. Mara smiled, the relief brief but genuine. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, steady. Amos looked toward the lean-to, where Calder shifted his weight and sighed. The first outside vehicle arrived just after noon, its engine a familiar sound in a world that had been quiet too long. A county truck rolled into town trailing slush and disbelief. People gathered at a careful distance, not crowding, not panicking. They had learned something over the last weeks, how to wait without unraveling. With the convoy came a man Silas didn't know, tall and square-shouldered, wearing a weathered parka with a stitched county seal. His name was Deputy Marcus Hale, early 40s, clean-shaven except for a shadow that never quite left his jaw. He moved with the contained energy of someone used to walking into bad situations and leaving them better than he found them. When he shook Silas's hand, his grip was firm, respectful. "Heard a lot about this place," Hale said, glancing around the outpost. "Heard even more about you." Silas inclined his head. "Stories travel faster than trucks," Hale smiled. "They don't always arrive intact. They walked the shelves together. Hale asked practical questions: capacity, turnover, security. Silas answered. He didn't oversell. He didn't apologize. Hale's eyebrows lifted once, then settled. "You built this right," he said. "Most folks wait for permission." Silas shrugged. "Permission doesn't keep people warm." By afternoon, the town held a meeting, not an emergency one, not shouted through wind or fear. They gathered near the town office steps, coats open, breath visible but less frantic. Caldwell spoke first, naming what had happened, what had worked, and what hadn't. He named mistakes without blame. He named help without spectacle. Then he gestured to Silas. Silas stepped forward, feeling the familiar weight gather, not dread this time, but attention. Echo sat at his heel, tail sweeping once against the packed snow. "We didn't beat winter," Silas said. "We learned how to stand in it." He paused, letting the quiet do some of the work. "This place," he nodded toward the mountain, "worked because it was steady, because it was shared. That doesn't stop when the road's open." Murmurs rolled through the crowd, agreement threaded with understanding. Mara raised a hand. "We keep the ledger," she said. "We keep the rolls. We don't wait for the next storm to remember." Eleanor stepped forward. "We keep a clinic window," she added. "Supplies rotated, lists updated." Amos lifted his chin. "And we keep routes," he said. "Horse and truck, redundancy." Ruth Calderon, standing near the front with her cane planted firm, nodded once. "And we remember," she said, "who we were when it mattered." Silas looked out over them, faces tired, faces hopeful, faces that had learned the cost of both. He felt something ease that he hadn't realized he was holding. Not the vigilance, that stayed, but the solitude. By evening, supplies from the convoy were inventoried and staged, not dumped. Silas supervised without hovering. Caldwell handled security. Mara coordinated volunteers. Eleanor trained 2 aides from town, her voice calm, her hands guiding. Amos took Calder out once more, this time to haul timber to repair a collapsed shed. Echo followed, moving with the same measured purpose he always had, 9 years old and still entirely himself. As dusk settled, Silas returned to the outpost alone. He walked the rooms, checking nothing in particular, letting the place speak. The shelves were not bare, not full, balanced. The stove hummed softly. Outside, water trickled where ice had ruled. He opened the ledger and turned to a clean page. At the top, he wrote a single line: Cold Water Resilience Hub. Below it, he listed dates, names, roles. Not to preserve control, but to preserve memory. A knock came at the door. Silas opened it to find the small boy from before, bundled tight, standing with his mother. The boy held something in both hands, a crooked wooden tag, carved rough, with a dog's shape burned into it. "For Echo," the boy said, solemn as a promise. Echo lowered his head, ears soft. The boy smiled wide enough to hurt. Silas accepted the tag and fastened it to Echo's collar. "Thank you," he said. Later, when the town lights glowed steadier and the mountain exhaled its last cold breath of the season, Silas stepped outside and looked down the slope. He did not feel watched. He felt included. Echo leaned against his leg. Calder snorted softly from the lean-to. Below, Coldwater Pass settled into a quieter rhythm, changed but intact. Silas closed the door behind him, not to keep the world out, but to keep what they had built from drifting away. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with light from the sky or voices from above. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, through steady hands, disciplined hearts, and the courage to stay when it would be easier to leave. Maybe this wasn't magic at all. Maybe it was something God places deep inside ordinary people, the strength to prepare, the wisdom to protect, and the compassion to share when the world grows cold. In the harshest winter, it wasn't power, wealth, or luck that saved this town. It was faith expressed through action. In our own lives, we may not face snowstorms or frozen roads, but we all face moments of scarcity, of hope, of strength, of kindness. And just like in this story, God often works through us, asking not for perfection, but for willingness, to be steady, to be present, to be a shelter for someone else. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what this story made you reflect on. And if you believe that faith, kindness, and quiet courage can still change the world, please subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing stories like this together. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and grant you strength in every season of your life. And when the world grows cold, may you become someone else's miracle.